Welcome to the ID 16.9 podcast, where we delve into the issues relating to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, the goal aiming for legal identity for all, including birth registration, by 2030. We don't know how many people are living without a legal identity, but estimates have put the figure at over 1 billion. I'm your producer and host, Frank Hersey.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's always a pleasure to be back on the ID 16.9 podcast.
And Ayang is joining me to talk about the ID situation there, which covers many of the issues we talk about on the podcast, all in one country. We talk about exclusion quite a bit, but in Cameroon, the exclusion can be extreme, and it seems people have had enough. So, Ayang, to get us started, how about we take a look at the context? Because it's fair to say Cameroon has a unique situation going on which is relevant to ID.
That's right, Frank. Cameroon generally really needs no introduction, as it were, to the world for a number of reasons. And one of them is that not only is it the country with the oldest elected leader in the world at the moment, it is also a country experiencing a serious humanitarian crisis from an armed conflict in the English-speaking parts of the nation. So, for context, like you're asking, armed separatist fighters who call themselves Amber Boys have since the year 2017 been fighting against government forces in the northwest and southwest regions of the country. And their goal, they say, is to create an entirely new republic from the present Cameroon nation. This situation was born out of accumulated frustration of English-speaking Cameroonians against the Francophone-dominated regime in Yaoundé. So, from the foregoing, it's clear that the socio-political context in Cameroon at the moment is quite tense and sensitive, and which makes legal identity for citizens an important aspect of their daily living, given the security exigencies of the times.
And just tell us where you're currently speaking from.
I'm currently speaking from Yaoundé, the capital, the political capital.
Which is one of, well, really, it's a French-speaking area, but
Exactly, it's a French dominated city. It's the second largest city of the country, and that's where the political seat of the nation is.
there's something of an English-speaking community, of course, in Yaoundé itself, isn't there?
Sure, I'm speaking to you. I'm an English-speaking Cameroonian, but I live in Yaoundé. So there is, despite the differences and all of that, there is still that togetherness amongst the Cameroonian people. There are English-speaking Cameroonians who live in the French-speaking parts of the country, and there are French-speaking Cameroonians who live in the English-speaking parts of the country. So there is that mix of what they call in French vivre ensemble, which means living together.
I suppose that is a helpful background because there's more pressure in a way, as I understand it, across society. There's more tension, and so within that as a backdrop, there comes ID and whether or not people have ID. So I wondered if you could just talk us through what types of ID a person has or should have living in Cameroon, and what do they do, these different IDs?
Okay, thank you, Frank. The main official ID document required of every Cameroonian is what they call the National Identity Card, which is for now biometric. So the Cameroon National ID Card was instituted through a law back in 1990, so it's been more than 3 decades ago. So, however, I think I should say that first of all, the foundational ID, which every citizen needs to have, and that is the birth certificate, without which you cannot even establish a national ID in the first place. So, but there are currently hundreds of thousands of Cameroonians without birth certificates, many of them children, especially in the northern, eastern, and southern parts of the country. So I would say that the two major basic ID documents that a Cameroonian should have for life to be able to access a variety of public services are, first of all, a birth certificate, which you obtain after birth registration, and then a national identity card, which is obtained upon the presentation of a birth certificate. However, Frank, there are other ID credentials which people are not really obliged to have, but which they do require from time to time in their day-to-day transactions. These include, for example, the biometric youth card, which is a card that is meant for youth of a particular age group under a government program to be able to access certain government services on a preferential basis. And then we also have the biometric voter ID, which you can obtain if you register to vote when election time comes. And then there's of course the driver's license, which you can secure when you are done with a driving course. These are some of the ID credentials which Cameroonians have, but the two obligatory ones are the birth certificate, which is the foundational one, and then the
Mm.
national identity card.
And I think we're going to get onto just how important, well, especially the national identity card is, in a little bit. I suppose there's something I've got a bit of an observation there from living and reporting in West Africa, not too far away, about youth, and it may seem a little bit strange, possibly to some listeners, that there are things called, cards for the youth. I would say that sort of culturally, politically, youth as a category is perhaps more respected in West Africa, as it's going to be the next generation. They have a say. They should be getting involved in the running of a country, in politics. So definitely, where I was in Cote d'Ivoire, there was a big emphasis on youth as the future of the country. And obviously, these countries have got very young populations. So I suppose everybody wants to court young people. Just going back to the birth registrations, and you said that certain parts of the country were particularly badly affected with low registration rates,
Yes.
the English speaking areas.
Yes, the English speaking regions are part of these areas, especially now that there is a socio-political crisis. There are thousands of families that have been displaced from their original settlements, and many of them have lost their personal documentation in that process, some of them being birth certificates or ID cards. So, and because of the displacements, there are families that have lost wealth, have lost their sources of income, and so some of them don't even have money to pay to obtain some of these ID credentials. So it's yes, the English speaking parts of the country are part of these communities in Cameroon, which are finding it difficult to have either the birth
Mm.
certificate because of lack of birth registration, or the national ID card, which has more or less a national connotation.
So if we look at the national ID card, the biometric card, what are the problems then with the issuing of that card at the moment?
Well, there are a litany of problems, plaguing the smooth issuance of the national ID card in Cameroon. The problems have been there for many years, and it looks like they may not disappear anytime soon. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the problems is the lack of birth certificates, which is as a result of low birth registration in certain remote parts of the country, especially amongst illiterate, poor, or minority communities. So the state of Cameroon is actually aware of this problem, and
Mm.
it's through its different services, it is taking some measures in partnership with international organizations and even civil society groups in Cameroon to be able to encourage families to register their children at birth and to obtain the birth certificate. So another level, however, where a big problem lies is at the level of production. So what is happening here is actually curious. There are people who have gone for many years, Frank, without their ID card being
Mm.
produced. Often there is no convincing explanation from the authorities concerning this problem. Sometimes they argue that many of the cases of delay are caused by mismatches in information submitted by applicants. But although that's true, but that's not entirely true, because there are many other Cameroonians who believe that the problem is more of administrative, and that there's need for authorities to set up a more expedient ID card production mechanism, which will be able to issue the cards much faster. So just for a reminder, statutorily, you have to
Mm.
wait for 3 months to have your ID card after applying for it in Cameroon. But there are people who have gone for so many years without their original IDs. And this has largely given room for new phenomena like bribery and extortion in the
Mm.
ID card issuance process, as people are now forced to use unorthodox means to get their ID cards as quickly as they want.
I remember when we spoke last time, you said that your own card was it broken?
Was broken,
Have you
and I
managed?
could not go for a new one because I am afraid of the delays that I will encounter, the difficulties I will encounter in even replacing the broken card.
Uh-huh. I can imagine you in a couple of years' time with it in a sort of in like a plastic case, just to try and keep it going as long as possible.
That is how unfortunate the situation is, Frank.
So you've had your own issues in the past, not just in terms of getting the card, but what sorts of problems do people have without a national ID card in their daily life?
That's a good question. There in the current context of things in the country, like I explained earlier, so it's really difficult experience to live as a Cameroonian without an ID card. Apart from being unable to access certain services or carry out certain personal transactions, you can also be arrested and even jailed according to the laws in force. In fact, the 1990 law establishing the national ID card in Cameroon stipulates that anyone found in a public place without his ID card with him can be arrested. The examples are also many. There are thousands of Cameroonians who have missed opportunities for employment, travel, or school admission
Mm,
because they had no valid national ID card at a given point in time. So, in a recent report I did for biometric updates on the situation,
mhm,
I got some mind-boggling testimonies. In fact, I spoke to a colleague who said he has been unable to get his ID card for the past 2 years after his previous card expired. So there are certain financial transactions he cannot carry out. There are certain things he can't do because what he has is the ID card application receipt, which is not, of course, the original card. So it has its own limitations.
Is it quite normal then for people in Cameroon to be using these paper receipts issued as de facto ID?
Well, at the time of applying for the ID card, that is the application receipt is issued as a de facto ID, which you can use for over the next 3 months until your original ID card is printed out. So, but there are so many people who have held that receipt for 3 months, the normal 3 months within which your ID card should have been produced, but
Mm,
which has not been produced, and so they are forced to keep using the card. So what they do is they take the receipt to an ID card production center, and a police official puts a stamp on it to say the expiry date of this application receipt has been extended to a new date, so that probably within that period your new ID card would be available. So there are people who undergo this process for as many times as possible without the original card ever coming out.
mhm,
So that is the constraint. So like I was citing the example of this colleague I spoke to another person who said for the past 3 years he has spent about $850 in order to fast track the renewal of his ID card because at some point he needed to get a passport for a foreign travel. So there are also cases of Cameroonians who suffer without an ID card because they don't even have money to give bribes or to give
So
officials to ensure that they can get their ID cards early enough.
how much should an ID card cost just going, through the normal means via the police station?
Through the normal means, the official rate for an ID card is franc CFA 2,800. That's the franc CFA, which is a currency in Cameroon used by Cameroon.
Hmm.
So that in US dollars, that's approximately five US dollars or less.
So how did this person end up spending $800?
He told me that when he applied through the normal procedure, the card didn't come out, within the 3 months that he expected it. So, and he needed it urgently. So what he did was there is an official in the production chain who met him and proposed that he gives him some money so he'll be able to fast track the production process as a personnel of the police of the police department producing the ID card. So what he said was 250,000 CFA francs, which in US dollars is almost 450 US dollars.
Mm.
So he paid that money, but after 1 month, there were no results. It looks like he was duped or something, and the official kept giving him reasons that were not convincing as to why the card had not been produced after receiving the bribes. So he had to go to another official and paid the same money. So this time around, he was lucky, but it was second time lucky, but he was By then, he had spent at least 850 US dollars, which is a very, very huge sum of money for an average Cameroonian. Many Cameroonians live below $1 a day. So you can imagine
Yeah.
how many Cameroonians can even afford even $50 to fast track an ID card, which is such an important ID document for their daily transactions.
And so people end up using agents as well, don't they? Are they companies, or are they just people who have connections?
No, they are not agents as they were, or agencies, but they are people who have connection,
Like,
people who work. Some of these agents or middlemen are people who work within the ID production department. So they come and meet people who are desperate to get their ID cards fast enough, and then they propose them huge sums of tips or bribes to be able to help them. So, and that's how it happens. And clearly, the authorities are aware of the situation. It's not like they are unaware of it. They are aware of it, but there's nothing that is being done, officially speaking, to
mhm.
be able to clear the backlog of these millions of ID cards that have not been produced for the past couple of years.
And it's not just, I mean, you're talking about this person who ended up spending over $800 on bribes to get his card to then be able to apply for his passport to travel internationally. And isn't it the case, though, that you need ID for traveling internally in
You
Cameroon?
do, you do need the ID card to travel internally, and there are so many the things that you require a national ID card in Cameroon to do. To register for public exams, you need it to register to be able to vote. You can't travel easily within the country from one administrative region to another without an ID card, because you're going to meet security checkpoints on the way, and you have to identify yourself. And people who don't have ID cards are extorted, or sometimes they are kept in detention until they are able to comply with what the security officials tell them to do. So you can't carry out banking transactions. You can't open a bank account in Cameroon
Hmm.
if you don't have the national ID card. You can't buy and register a SIM card in Cameroon if you don't have the national ID card. You can't sit public exams. You can't get a passport. You can't get a driver's license. So in reality, there are a litany of things that you can't do as a citizen in
Mhm.
Cameroon without having the national ID card. So you can imagine how frustrating it is when citizens are unable to get this card under normal procedure, and they are forced sometimes to pay extra charges to get them.
Yeah, of course. Is there any indication as to how many people who should have an ID card, so I suppose it's adults, don't have an ID card?
I think the number is alarming. Although these figures are not being given
Hmm.
officially, but I spoke to some sources within the national delegation for the general delegation for national security, which is the authority issuing
Hmm.
national ID cards in Cameroon. There are at least 10 million or about 10 million Cameroonians eligible to have a
Hmm.
national ID card, because in Cameroon by law you are eligible to have a national identity card when you turn 18.
Hmm.
So there are at least 10 million of this number of people in Cameroon, or even more, but they are not up to six of them who actually have the card. So the problem is quite huge, and that is why there's been pressure from so many quarters for the authorities that be to be able to handle the situation before it degenerates further.
So fewer than 6 million people have the card.
Yes, there are fewer than 6 million people in Cameroon with a valid national ID card out of a possible 10 to 12 million people who should have
Hmm.
who are above the age of 18 and more.
One of the uses for the national ID is to vote.
Yes.
I understand, voter turnout has been fairly low before, not necessarily just because people don't have ID. Maybe they just didn't want to vote. I know it's not always that clear. But what's the election commission doing about this?
Okay, the Election Commission in Cameroon, which is officially known as Elections Cameroon, ELECAM, is actually concerned about this situation. And I
Mhm.
interviewed him. I asked him the question. What he said they were doing was they are in talks with authorities of the ID issuing department
Is
to
this
be able
the
to
is this
make.
the chairman?
He is the chairman of the Elections Cameroon, Dr. Eno Abrams Egbe.
Hmm.
So he said they are quite aware of the problem. It's a huge problem, and that there are so many Cameroonians who ought to be on the electoral register who are not, because they don't have national ID cards, either because they don't have birth certificates, first of all, or that they have not been able to apply for the ID cards. Yeah, so he said it's a huge problem, but they have been in talks with the DJSN to be able to see how to clear the backlog and to fix some of the hindrances. Yeah, however, he also thinks that the problem partly lies with the population. So, because he says he was told by the DJSN that there are thousands of ID cards that are lying on tables in production centers across the country, which have not been withdrawn by their owners. So he thinks that while so many people are complaining, there are others whose cards have actually been produced. But yeah, so but I think the election commission is concerned about it, and they say they will continue to press on to ensure that the ID card situation is regularized.
And what do you think about that? How credible do you think it is that there are piles and piles of many thousands of ID cards? I know from reports I've done as well for Biometric Update about Nigeria, where there's similar statements from the authorities on people not coming to pick up their biometric voter cards or people not coming up to pick up their passports. Yet the overall problem is a massive backlog in processing them. So it just seems a bit of a conflict to me that there's such a demand and a long wait to get these cards. What does it seem like to you there in Cameroon? Does it seem true that there could be piles of thousands and thousands of uncollected cards?
Yes, Frank. True that there are piles of those uncollected cards, but if you look at the number of the cards that are there, you can't equate them to the number of applicants who are in waiting to get their original cards. There's a big difference.
Mm,
The police commissioner in charge of ID cards said there were about 300,000 or so uncollected cards in different police stations across the country. So 300,000 is nothing compared to about 2 to 3 million people whose cards have not been produced and for which no convincing reason has been given.
mhm,
They have application receipts that have been the expiry dates have been extended from now and then. So clearly, yeah, the authorities are using the uncollected cards to make a case for themselves, but I don't think that case is strong enough. The issue is with about expediency. There is need for expediency in the process of producing the cards. And that's what so many Cameroonians are saying, that there is need for the authorities to put in place a system. It's true that the Cameroonian authorities initiated a project to put in place a new ID card production system.
mm,
So they even launched a tender to get a new biometric passport supplier, which was done, but the project has since been blocked.
hmm,
Normally, we're supposed to have a new ID card production center in Cameroon from March of 2021, 2022, I beg your pardon. So, but since then, nothing has been said about the project, and
hmm,
it looks like there is some infighting, who knows, but the project is still on hold. So Cameroonians are waiting for a new ID card production system, just like the passport system that is in place. At
mhm,
least Cameroon now has a passport system where you can have a passport within 48 hours.
mhm.
It used to be 1 month before then. So they think that it can also be done with the ID card.
Are the next elections 2025 for Cameroon?
Yes, there are general elections in 2025 for Cameroon. There are elections of members of the National Assembly, which is the lower house of Cameroon's parliament, and then the presidential election.
I suppose even the next general elections, 2025, is not that far away given how long it's
Not at
taking
all.
people to get the national ID that they need. I mean, obviously, as an outsider voting in Cameroon, I mean, Paul Biya's been in since what 40 years now.
Exactly, yeah. He's been there since November 1982. So he celebrated his 40 years as a president of Cameroon on November 6, 2022. So he's been there. And you talk about, people may say, oh no, the ID card issue is not affecting the voter turnout. But I think it does in some way because
Mm,
over the years, the voter registration figures in Cameroon have hardly gone beyond 8 million.
mm,
Whereas Cameroon has at least 15 million or more eligible voters. Because in Cameroon, you can only vote when you are 20. You can have an ID when you're 18, but you must vote when you have attained 20. The figures have never been above 8 million registered voters. So you can't say that it's not because the people are not interested in voting. Many of them want
mhm,
to, but they don't have the ID card to vote, especially in remote communities. Because Cameroon is still a developing nation, and so there are so many sections of the country that are really underdeveloped and hosting poor people, poor communities that don't have access to good roads and all of that, so they can't easily move in and out of their community. So most of them are there. They have attained the age of having an ID card, but they cannot because either an ID card production center is not found in their locality, or it is found far away and they can't be able to travel to get there, or for so many other reasons. So it's a mix of so many challenges that are facing the country.
And I suppose for the majority of the population now, President Biya is all they've ever known. He's been in power their whole lives, and they're
Sure,
unable to
sure.
vote against that should they want to.
Exactly. So, about 70% or 75% of Cameroonians are less than the age of 35. So almost the entire country has known just a small fraction of people above 40 have known the other president who was there before him, President Amado Ahijo.
I mean, that is fascinating in in its own right, isn't it?
It looks like we are living in a strange planet, right?
And so, in that 40-year rule, there's been various different. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of legislation being brought in, but just going back to what you were saying earlier on, how you have to by law carry ID in Cameroon, and so
Yes.
obviously we're hearing, there's the legal requirement, but then people don't have ID. So, what sorts of
Yeah.
issues does that lead to?
Well, it can lead to so many issues. Like I mentioned earlier, it could lead to arrest. If you are traveling, for example, and you arrive at checkpoint where you have to identify yourself and you cannot because you don't have the ID card, money will either be extorted from you
Mm,
by the security officers, or in some extreme cases when they feel you look too suspicious, probably physically from their own judgment, you could be detained. You could even be jailed. So there are just so many inconveniences that go with you not having the national ID card in Cameroon. So that's why so many Cameroonians are worried, and are really, really calling on the powers that be to try to check the situation. And this leads me to the issue of pressure,
mhm,
because the situation is not like Cameroonians are so satisfied with it. There are people who have been speaking out about it. So indeed, there's been huge pressure on the authorities in Yaoundé for the situation to be addressed. But the question some of us are asking is how responsive are these authorities to the pressure, because the situation is clearly not changing. We have politicians and other rights activists who have been speaking about it. Some activists, of course, have even written to the President of the Republic, written open letters to President Paul Biya to take urgent actions on the matter. There's also been an online campaign, which is called Je veux ma CNE. That is French. In English, it means I want my ID card. So
mhm.
that campaign has been online for the past year or two on Twitter. It's also been on Facebook. So that's the situation. However, but because Frank, because the situation is apparently not changing, there are some Cameroonians who think that the pressure is not good enough.
Mhm.
This group of Cameroonians think that there should be more pressure, even from higher state authorities. Some are even suggesting that there should be a parliamentary debate on the issue. Why not? Because it's become an issue of national concern. It affects a vast majority of Cameroonians, and so the ID card is an obligation to have. So why should it not require a parliamentary debate for MPs or lawmakers to ask government executive what is happening? Why are Cameroonians suffering this much? So there are people who think that there is need for parliamentary action on this aspect. So that's the situation, Frank. But what I know is that the administration is very aware of the situation, and probably they are trying to figure out how they are going to address it. Because in Cameroon, there is always if an excuse, the phrase which is an excuse which government always gives when it doesn't execute certain projects of national interest. It always says that the state machinery grinds slowly but surely. So probably they are grinding slowly and surely to finding a solution to that problem.
Well, it sounds as like some of the state machinery is also using the ID requirement law against activists, isn't it? So
Yes,
trying to
yes.
pin that as a crime on them.
Exactly. Yes, and that's why I was about mentioning the situation of or the popular Anglophone activist
Mm,
Mancho BBC, who led peaceful protests in the town of Bamenda in 2017, when the current crisis had not taken the dimension of an armed conflict yet. So he led peaceful protests to protest
mhm.
against the injustices of the regime in Yaoundé, and he was hunted down by security officials and arrested. And at the time of his arrest, he didn't have his ID card, national ID card on him. So it's not clear whether he didn't have one or he didn't have it in possession at that time. So one of the charges that were leveled against him was the non-possession of an ID card in a public place. So you can imagine the extent to which somebody can be punished, a citizen can be punished for not having an ID card.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they don't care whether when they arrest you, they don't care whether your card has actually been produced, you applied for it and it was produced, or you actually have it but you forgot to take it along with you. For most cases, the issue is they arrest you when your card you have applied for it and it has actually not been produced, and that's not none of your fault.
Mm,
So it's the fault of the administrators, the ID issuing authorities who are delaying in issuing the card.
mm,
But it is the user who has to pay the price. So that is why it's even more aching, and people are thinking that the situation has to be reversed.
And it's dangerous as well, isn't it, to get
It
too
is. It
pushy,
is.
even as an individual? Because there wasn't there a case of somebody going into a police station and losing patience and demanding his ID that he was waiting for? What happened to him?
Exactly. Yeah, that one gentleman called Dauda. It happened in a small town in the west region of Cameroon called Fumbot. So he's a young man who has stayed for about 2 years or so without his ID card, and each time he goes to the police station where he applied for it, he is told the card is not yet out, and and living in that area, it's really complicated for him. He says he cannot access certain things, even for his personal security, because if there is a security swoop on an area, you have to identify
Mm,
yourself. If security agencies, surround an area for arrest, everybody who is picked up without an ID card, you are considered a suspect automatically because you have no card to identify who you are. So he has gone through all sorts of hassles, and he thought that that day enough was enough. So he went to that police station. When asked, they said his card was not yet available. So he started vibrating and shouting to the top of his voice, asking why, Cameroonians were being treated this way and all of that. The police officers on duty thought it was disturbance of public order, and so they got him a bit physically manhandled, and then he was detained. So he was kept in custody for so many weeks.
mm,
It was only released, I think, in November. This incident happened in October 2022, and then he was released about a month after, in November of the same year.
mm.
So you can imagine somebody goes to get his ID card, he loses his patience, which is not too extraordinary, and then he's detained for so many weeks. So this is just one of many cases that exist, not an isolated case, Frank. There are so many cases in different communities which are even unreported
Mm,
in the media. This one happened because it happened in a town where it could easily be spotted by the media.
mhm.
So, and this incident sparked outcry from activists, from Cameroonians in general, because so many Cameroonians identify themselves with Dauda,
God.
who has stayed for 2 years without his ID card, without any explanation, and so he wants the situation to be redressed.
And what do you think the chances are of there being a parliamentary debate? Do you think there's going to be enough public pressure to push it into Parliament?
Yes, I think if the matter is picked up by Parliament, I think there can be a headway. We have had, even though the Parliament in Cameroon is often described by opposition politicians as a rubber stamp Parliament, a hand clapping Parliament, because it's dominated by the majority, the ruling party, the CPDM party. Has about three quarters of the parliamentarians who hardly reject any government proposal. So, and Cameroon's parliament also has a history of not introducing private member bills.
Mhm.
Like an individual MP could stand up and say, okay, I'm moving a motion for a debate on the national ID card issue, which has become an issue of national shame and all of that. But since there's no that history, it is allowed, according to the parliamentary rules, for private members' bills to be introduced in parliament. But that has hardly happened because sometimes it is quashed if the government thinks it's a bill that wants to challenge a particular government aspect. So the majority MPs quash it, and so it doesn't go through at all for plenary debates. Yeah. So however, there are people who think if Parliament takes it up, I think it would show some seriousness.
Mhm.
There are also people who think the Cameroon Human Rights Commission should pick up the matter because it's also an issue of human rights. Because if the law obliges you to have an ID card, and then you follow due process to have it, and there's no explanation for you from the issuing authority why you are not having the card, then in some way it's an abuse of your right to
Hmm.
have the ID card. So there are people who think it's also an issue of human rights. The Cameroon Human Rights Commission has to intervene and to call the executive powers to order. Yeah, they think that the pressure should move from just maybe civil society or social media campaigns to actions taken by state institutions and even state authorities to make it more serious, because it's actually a very serious problem at the moment.
And do you think there's any chance of changes being made ahead of the elections with enough time for people to actually get their cards in order to vote?
Well, it's possible if the authorities heed the calls of Cameroonians. I'm sure they can be a change. Let me just give you a quick example. Before the ahead of the 2011 presidential election, President Paul Biya took a decision to decree the issuance of free ID cards to Cameroonians. You know that
Hmm.
you are applying for the card for free. You are not paying the fee that is required of you to have it. So it was an opportunity for so many Cameroonians who didn't have the money at the time, the $5 or so at the time, to be able to apply for the card for free and get it. So it looks like there was some special mechanism that expedited the production of the cards before that 2011 presidential election. So it is also possible that those measures can be taken now ahead of the 2025 elections, because we have about 2 years to those elections. So if the authorities really love the country, if they really want the democracy they are talking about to prevail, to thrive, then if they want more voter participation, then there is need to take certain executive actions to be able to allow people to have ID cards. But personally, I think the first thing they should do, I would insist, is to have a new ID card production system in place.
Hmm.
Get a new ID card supplier, like they did for the passports.
Hmm.
The German firm Ojantik is the one producing the passports now. So they are doing it, fast enough. Now the ID cards are produced by Thales, but let them probably, if the problem is not at the level of Thales necessarily,
Hmm.
but let them get some other contractor to do the job for Cameroonians, because there are so many people who are able to produce ID cards quickly for citizens.
Hmm.
So get in place a new ID card production system. I'm sure every other problem will be solved.
Hmm.
Just get in place a new system, expedite it like the passport system, and all will be solved.
Well, where there's a political will, there's a way.
Exactly. And that requires political will, like you say. So yeah, for now, it looks like there's no political will yet because of certain egoistic and underground
Hmm.
interests and influences and all of that, according to confirmed reports that we hear from here and there, that there are some unseen battles that are being fought over the ID card contract, which
Hmm.
is said to be a mega, multi-million contract. So everybody wants to fight about it, and which is not strange, because contracts have always been a contentious issue in Cameroon. Public contracts awards, and
Hmm.
be it in the sector of road construction, in the sector of energy, the sector of supplies of public materials for public offices and public procurement. There have always been issues. Really, really little wonder that this ID card situation is really dragging on because of unseen battles at the level of whatever the presidency or wherever the battles are. But Cameroonians believe there are battles.
Well, it's clearly a very complex situation, even if it is based on the simple requirement to have national ID, but that it's one ID piece. I suppose in other countries, if it is about voting, you could have a national ID, but then you would require an additional voter ID.
Voter ID, sure.
And maybe in certain situations, access to those cards is controlled, but people can still get on with their everyday life with their other IDs. I think
Yes,
Cameroon just seems a particularly extreme example of the issues of not having legal ID.
exactly. I think it is, because you have to go through a whole lot of difficulties to be able to live without an ID. Practically, you can't live with one. I
Hmm.
mean, from practical experience, you can't live in Yaoundé or anywhere in Cameroon without a national ID on. How do you begin? If
Hmm.
you can't have a passport, you can't identify yourself, you can't get a financial transaction done, you can't register for any public exam, you can't even, they don't even know you to begin with. So who are you?
Hmm.
So that's why the legal ID begins from having that ID first. And Cameroon is one of those examples, like you say.
Well, Ayang, thank you so much for explaining the situation and sharing a little bit about your own experience and life in Cameroon. It's great to have a colleague who's also a political reporter in Cameroon and who knows the situation
Exactly.
in and out at every level. So thank you once again, Ayang Macdonald in Cameroon.
Thank you very much, Frank. It was a pleasure to be part of your program.
That was Biometric Update contributor and political reporter Ayang Macdonald speaking to me from Yaoundé. To find out more about the UN's Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, to listen to more episodes, or to get the full transcripts, go to the ID 16.9 podcast website at id169.com. And see if you think we're on track for legal identity for all by 2030.